A frankly ridiculous 21 years ago and counting, we were shifted into Turbo, starting with the second Power Rangers theatrical film release, Turbo, a Power Rangers movie, and as part of that we were introduced to our 7th Megazord, the Turbo Megazord. Naturally, you'd expect them to be starting to repeat themselves by now. But no, once again they gave us a theme unlike any that we'd had in the previous 4 seasons. And I believe that Turbo actually helped set the Zord blueprint for seasons to come. Having said that, this is not a great Megazord. But it is a better Megazord now than it seemed at the time. It's complicated, so let's review. Let's talk toy history. So the first release of this toy was by Bandai Japan during the 1997 toy line for Gekiso Sentai Carranger, where it was badged up as DX RV Robo. As was the standard back then, we got it a year later, where despite first appearing in Turbo, a Power Rangers movie, it did not receive a movie box release like the Ninja Megazord and Falcon Zord had 3 years earlier. I expect the reason for this was because the first movie came at a time where Thunder Zords were on the shelves, and the movie packaging served as quite a good point of comparison to help those that were struggling to tell the difference. But in America, the Turbo movie premiered just 3 weeks before the Turbo TV series, so they didn't need to have a separate box design going because it was all part of the same toy line. I actually got this one used off eBay a couple of years ago, and unfortunately I don't have the box for it. Some of the sticker application isn't great, and someone took a real chewy liking to the Power Sword. Why is that such a common thing? It's really gross. But to have all the pieces and not be too scratched up, I think is quite a good result when the eBay prices for this thing are sometimes crazy. This one luckily didn't cost me too much. Why didn't I have this or any of the Zords from the Turbo toy line at the time? Well, there's 3 main memories I have for Turbo. First, there was the movie, which I didn't actually see until months later by borrowing the home video release from one of my brother's friends. I remember it being weird at the time because it was obvious that this was actually in the TV show continuity, unlike the first film, and it did just seem less ambitious. Then of course, it's the parts of the toy line that I did own, starting with the Red Ranger figure and the mini Turbo Ram, which I loved because it separated and gave weapons to the 5 Rangers. I can remember playing with those 2 alongside the rest of the Zeo team, and actually accidentally broke the very brittle thumbs off the Zeo yellow and pink automorphins because I was making them hold the turbo weapons, which weren't quite right for them. Eventually I'd go on to get turbo blue, green and pink, but even back then I never got yellow. These were the days long before you could look up the entire toy line on the internet. You basically had the Argos catalogue and whatever else you could get your hands on. I very memorably had a Toy Master placemat of it. For anyone that doesn't know what these are, it's to go under your plate on the dinner table. That's why the logo is in the middle. So the toy store obviously hopes that you'll look down and get obsessed with the toys and badger your parents over the dinner table for them. It's now kind of outdated evil genius behaviour that's been replaced by the internet, but back at the time I really appreciated it as a kid. And I remember even back then thinking how good the Turbo Rescue Megazord looked, and I guess the Turbo Megazord looked okay too. I also really remember the episode where the original cast left. What is fun, and obviously we didn't know at the time, is that over the years, all of the original cast apart from Nakia would go on to make various appearances back on the show, some more than others. But that moment was a severe mic drop, and it kind of confirmed the peer pressure I was getting from my classmates too, which was that everyone else my age, which was 10 at the time, had already moved on to the next thing, that we'd gotten too old for Power Rangers now. Justin annoyed me from his very introduction, then they pulled the nonsense of writing out Zordon and Alpha 5, and lastly they got rid of the cast that I'd effectively grown up with and replaced them with 4 new people that I didn't care about. I can remember it all just left a very sour taste, and I think they eventually find the right pattern from Lost Galaxy onwards, where it's just a cold new start each year. But yeah, trying to write out one cast and swap them out with another while the main story continues in the background just didn't work for me. Now, years later, I can understand that they were just tinkering and experimenting with the show, seeing what they could switch out without breaking it, and Tommy working at his uncle's car garage was almost like a metaphorical location for what was happening to the show itself. But at the time, it just seemed like the show didn't want me as a viewer either. So that's the very long-winded reasoning behind why I didn't have any of the Turbo Zords at the time. I just didn't have the passion for it that I'd had up until then, because the show just seemed to be starting over again and almost forgetting where it had come from. Which leads us nicely into talking about the toy design. So, 5 cars that can turn into 1 robot, hey? Sure. I can remember this feeling both refreshing and anticlimactic. After years of Zords being based on dinosaurs, animals, warriors and ancient civilizations, here we have a Megazord where 1/5 of it is based on a minivan. It all seemed very conventional and I guess it just didn't grab me the same way. I kind of got where they were coming from too. I had the same cynicism when Pixar made their first Cars film 8 years later. Toys of cars were kind of a tried and tested thing to sell mostly to boys, so Power Rangers, through the vein of Super Sentai of course, were going to get on board too. The Turbo Zords were also unique in that they were actually created by the Rangers themselves in the power chamber. They were created for their movie quest, and the first description of them as spoken by Tanya in the film was, "They're just ordinary cars." Maybe our Rangers should have put a bit more effort into their own designs, hey? For the first time we had Zords based on real-world vehicles. Red Lightning was the sleek race car, very small as well, and obviously the coolest looking of the 5. Mountain Blaster was the 4x4, the biggest Zord, and actually, although different, just as good as Red's. Desert Thunder, the minivan. Poor Adam, hey. First he got a frog, then his toy version of the green Super Zord 4 was hardly nimble, and now his final Zord is a minivan. I'm kind of surprised he didn't quit when Rocky left. Dune Star, the SUV, to me, always seemed exactly like Adam's minivan, but technically it has a longer bonnet, a different amount of doors, and the grille on the front is changed. Wind Chaser, the sports car, another good design I think, third best after red and blue. Did you notice they all have ridiculous names? Perhaps after the generic numbered Zords in Zeo, they went really far the other way. The Zord names were actually made part of the morphin call for them to get their turbo powers, so they did become catchily familiar. I think one of the most memorable parts of the Turbo Zords are the headlights and that brilliant shot of the 5 driving together where they're so bright. So it was always a bit of a shame that there was no regard given to that in the toys. I've actually painted all of mine metallic yellow or white and I think they look much better, though holographic stickers would actually have been a better solution. I do think that if Soul of Chogokin or even Hasbro one day remake this Megazord, then they should somehow looking into getting the headlights to light up, maybe through batteries. Would they do that for each Zord? I don't know, but it's wishlist material. I also silver painted all the hubcaps on the Zords and the power vehicle wording on the tyres. However, I didn't paint the wording on Red Lightning's tyres because I thought the friction when it combines with the Mountain Blaster would just cause some of it to rub off. So Zordon said, "Individually they are formidable fighting machines, but when merged together they form the Turbo Megazord, the most powerful Zord ever created." Really? Really? More powerful than Pyramidas? And also the Turbo Megazord got destroyed by one monster. But if you can't strike up the enthusiasm for this as a Megazord, then how about as the second of our 3 theatrical Megazords? Yeah, I know, 27 years of Power Rangers so far, and yet the 3 Megazord choices for the movies have all been objectively terrible. I'll give it this though, and that's the transformation sequence. It's interesting how they all drive into the combination, and it had this great energy on the TV series version as they never stopped until becoming a Megazord. There was so much kinetic movement to the transformation. I think it really showed how far Sentai had come in their filming technique. All 5 cars effectively become this moving pile-up, and then flip up 90 degrees into Megazord mode when the helmet's finally revealed in a last flourish. I think the positioning of all the bases of the Zords being on the Megazord's back is quite rare, and we wouldn't see that again until the Omega Megazord in Lightspeed Rescue, or more recently in Sentai of Takuja. On the show it became a lot flatter looking in Megazord mode, which neither this deluxe toy nor either of the smaller releases could ever do justice to. What are the differences to the original Japanese release? Well, actually all the bits that appear here as dark grey plastic should actually be chrome, or debatably should be chrome. Yes, that's how they did it in Japan, but for some of the Zords you cannot actually understand why Bandai America changed it. I don't mind, for example, the roof racks of green, yellow and pink being that grey plastic, because in Megazord mode they're in quite precarious positions along the forearms and the toes, where damage is much more common, and you do often see that on other people's RV Robos. Also, it arguably gives the Zords more texture to be made up of different materials, and they gave us a bit of chrome on the grills for 3 and 4 anyway. As ever, there is less paint, and the hubcap solution I think is one that you should probably go with. There's less die-cast use, and unfortunately a worse power sword. I like that part of theirs appears as gold. Like with the Zord headlights, I've actually painted the parts of the sword that are meant to be lights. You know what though, I don't think there's anything massively offensively different, and this is actually one release where I don't think you need to go out of your way to get the Sentai version. Or maybe you do, because what's bad about it? Well, as Zords, I don't find them that interesting. Now, I've never watched Carranger, but I know it's a slightly more slapstick series, and I imagine some of the humour of that comes from the designs for these Zords being quite so basic. And also the first Megazord combination sequence that gets shown on the TV series is obviously from Carranger, and the way Tommy is looking at an instruction manual on how to form the Megazord when this is actually his 8th Zord, and how Cat's airbag pops out when combining with Justin's Zord, even now is all just painfully goofy, and tonally humour that just doesn't jive with the less comical tone that Power Rangers had and that Turbo continued. Turbo would have been a good candidate to have refilmed all the cockpit scenes like they do in the more recent seasons, and then they wouldn't have had the jarring effect of the movie cockpits being completely different. Onto what makes it bad as a toy though, well, the red lightning doesn't actually connect in that well in Megazord mode, it's just one clip holding it in place. And I find it often sticks out just a little bit more than it should. When transforming Pink Ranger's Windchaser Zord, moving the panels out into the arm mode I find really tricky each time, and when attached they do dip in at the sides a little bit too much. Blue's Mountain Blaster is a bit boxy, which you would expect, but as in it looks like a box. It doesn't have much shape to it. And then the roof racks for Dune Star and Desert Thunder, which go on to be the Megazord's toes I guess, look very big and rather odd. The Megazord head looks both too small and just generally wrong, like the designer was having a bit of an off year. Proportions are strange, his legs look massive, like chunky tree roots, then he's got that little head and that boxy body. Also, I know this becomes the pattern again from here onwards, but let's not let them off the hook. After a year with really flexible Megazords with elbows, we're back to just the regular up-down posability. Off that downer though, what's good about it? Well, for the first time since the Season 1 Dino Megazord, Turbo Megazord has a sword and a shield again. There was a shield with Shogun Megazord, but it wasn't really ever used. There is a lot of technical achievement here, and they've definitely got the best bits on show on the front of the Megazord. Maybe this is reaching a bit, but this is also technically the last Megazord for the extended Mighty Morphin cast. It's Adam, Kat and Tanya's final Zords, and Tommy's last Zord as a Red Ranger. They're also the first Zords to initially appear as regular sized vehicles, then like how the Zeo Rangers were grown to large size to fight King Mondo, the cars can morph into larger versions. This reason arguably is neither good nor bad, but after a year where the Megazords were themed on a given colour, like Zeo Megazord being mostly blue, Super Zeo Megazord being mostly grey, it's nice that once again we're back to the core colours of the Rangers. Though Pink Ranger Zord is mostly white because that's how things were back then. This was our first Megazord to use diecast, but wouldn't be the last. Notably as the light cage on Mountain Blaster and the leg snapping pegs. Transformers and Power Rangers reviewer on his YouTube video made me realise that there is a lot of craft that's gone into this thing. We have 5 Zords with a relatively simple but brilliant set of transformations. As a Megazord, they don't look exactly like the cars they started as. Compare that to the Tokuja toy line and especially Tok-O, where they did minimal transformation to the trains. You can really see the effort that went into the Turbo Megazord design. This was also back in the day where there were transformational parts just for aesthetics sake. Moving the middle carriage of Windchaser up to become shoulder pads serves no purpose other than to make the arms look more real, with broader shoulders and gaps for elbows it doesn't actually use, and just look less like a car. Same for the mesh of car grills around the knees. These hide the fronts of the 3 cars they come from. They have a spring-loaded panel within Mountain Blaster which only opens up in the Megazord transformation mode. These days that would probably just be a hole, with no thought of a panel having gone there in Zord mode because it's not actually necessary, it's out of sight. But it does serve to show off the attention to detail, even in a season with a theme as simple as this. Oh, and a special mention about the wheels, they're all labelled Power Vehicle CR-400, 600 or 800, depending on how big they are. A very nice touch. I don't know what CR is supposed to mean and the internet didn't reveal it either. If you know, let me know in the comments, but it sounds real enough. Don't get me wrong, because there is a lot to like in terms of the Turbo Zords they produced. But while it's an achievement of design, and what's to come is more impressive, for me it just doesn't reach the pinnacle of epicness that was Power Rangers Zeo. I hope you've liked this one. Do you guys have mixed thoughts on the Turbo Megazord as well? It'd be good to get your thoughts in the comments. Thanks to everyone that's subscribed to the channel recently, and do look out for my next retro review. And if complexity is more your bag, wait till we get to this guy's brother, the Turbo Rescue Megazord. Check out how these guys look beside the vehicle modes of this year's 2019 series over on my Instagram at PowerRangergram. And until the next time, see you later.